Tonight, we leave behind the polished boots, heroic gunfights, and dramatic sunsets of Hollywood to meet the working cowboys of the real American West. Their lives were rarely filled with adventure from morning to night, because most of their time was spent performing repetitive and physically demanding labor. A cowboy was not usually an independent wanderer, but a hired worker responsible for protecting cattle that belonged to a rancher or investment company. He worked long hours for modest wages, slept outdoors for weeks at a time, and depended on his companions for safety and survival. Some cowboys carried revolvers, but a reliable rope, a strong saddle, practical clothing, and a well-trained horse were usually far more important. Their work required patience because cattle could be stubborn, unpredictable, easily frightened, and surprisingly difficult to move across unfamiliar country. Cowboys endured burning sunlight, freezing rain, dust storms, river crossings, insects, injuries, loneliness, and nights of broken sleep. They came from different backgrounds, including Mexican, Black, Indigenous, European American, and mixed communities across the Western territories. Although popular culture turned them into symbols of individual freedom, real cowboys survived by cooperating closely and following strict instructions. As the evening grows quiet, let us ride slowly into their world and discover what it truly meant to work as a cowboy in the Wild West. The American cowboy did not suddenly appear after the Civil War because his traditions had been developing in Spanish and Mexican territories for generations. Spanish colonists brought cattle and horses into parts of North America where skilled livestock workers became known by the Spanish word vaqueros. Mexican vaqueros developed sophisticated methods of riding, roping, branding, herding, and managing cattle across large areas of open land. Their equipment included specialized saddles, ropes, spurs, leather leggings, and broad hats designed for long days beneath the sun. American ranchers adopted these techniques as cattle operations expanded across Texas, California, New Mexico, and other western regions. The language of the range also carried Hispanic influence through words such as rodeo, ranch, bronco, lasso, corral, mustang, and buckaroo. Black cowboys entered the cattle industry in significant numbers after emancipation, bringing farming, riding, livestock, and survival skills to the western ranges. Indigenous men also worked with horses and cattle, sometimes as independent ranchers and sometimes as employees navigating a rapidly changing economy. The cowboy tradition was therefore never the creation of a single ethnic group, despite the narrow image later promoted in books and movies. Every rope thrown across the range carried traces of older knowledge passed between cultures, generations, ranches, and individual workers. A young man searching for cowboy work usually needed practical ability more than an impressive appearance or a reputation for bravery. Ranch owners wanted workers who could remain in the saddle, handle difficult horses, recognize brands, repair equipment, and obey the trail boss. Experienced cowboys could judge the condition of an animal, notice changes in weather, locate water, and read tracks across hard or dusty ground. A newcomer might begin with unpleasant jobs around the ranch before anyone trusted him with valuable horses or large groups of cattle. Employment was often seasonal, with the busiest periods arriving during roundups, branding, calving, and long cattle drives toward railroad markets. Wages varied according to location, experience, responsibility, and economic conditions. But ordinary cowboys rarely became wealthy from their work. Their pay could disappear quickly when they purchased clothing, equipment, food, lodging, alcohol, or entertainment during visits to town. Some workers remained loyal to one ranch, while others moved frequently in search of better wages, kinder employers, or more dependable conditions. Reputation mattered because ranching communities exchanged information about workers who were skilled, dishonest, reckless, dependable, or cruel to animals. Getting hired was only the first challenge, because the cowboy then had to prove himself through countless ordinary tasks performed correctly every day. Cowboy clothing developed in response to sun, wind, dust, thorny plants, rough saddles, frightened cattle, and rapidly changing weather. The famous wide-brimmed hat shaded the face and neck, diverted rain, carried water, encouraged a fire, and occasionally signaled across open country. A practical cowboy selected his hat for comfort and durability rather than shaping it merely to create a fashionable silhouette. A bandana protected the mouth from dust, absorbed sweat, covered the neck against sunlight, and served as a bandage during emergencies. Durable shirts and trousers protected the skin, although repeated riding, sweat, rain, and campfire smoke gradually wore down even strong fabric. Leather chaps shielded the legs from brush, horns, rope burns, and bad weather when cowboys rode through difficult vegetation or worked among crowded cattle. Boots had raised heels that helped prevent the foot from sliding through a stirrup where a falling rider might otherwise be dragged by his horse. Spurs communicated subtle instructions to a trained horse, but careless or cruel use could injure the animal and reveal an inexperienced rider. Clothing was repaired repeatedly because replacing a torn shirt, worn boot, or damaged coat could require money and access to a distant store. The authentic cowboy looked weathered not because he followed a style, but because his clothing carried the accumulated evidence of demanding work. No partnership mattered more to a working cowboy than the relationship between the rider and the horses that carried him through each day. A cowboy might use several horses during a long drive because one animal could not safely perform every task without rest. Different horses possessed different strengths, with some suited to long travel and others better at turning quickly among nervous cattle. Before sunrise, the remuda of spare horses was gathered, so each rider could prepare the animal assigned to him for the day. Saddling required care because twisted blankets, damaged straps, or poorly adjusted equipment could injure a horse after hours of movement. A skilled rider guided his mount through pressure, balance, reins, voice, and small physical signals rather than relying entirely on force. Horses could stumble, panic, become sick, develop painful sores, or react suddenly to snakes, storms, fire, wildlife, and moving cattle. The loss of a dependable horse could leave a cowboy unable to perform his job and dangerously exposed in remote country. Cowboys therefore inspected hooves, watched for fatigue, adjusted tack, provided water, and learned the individual habits of the animals they rode. Beneath every story about a courageous rider stood an equally important horse whose endurance made the cowboys' work possible. One of the busiest periods of the ranching year began when cowboys gathered cattle that had wandered across broad ranges during the previous months. Riders spread across the landscape, searching ravines, hills, water sources, brush, and distant grazing areas for scattered groups of livestock. The cattle were gradually pushed toward a central location, where different ranches could identify animals by their brands and separate their herds. Cowboys needed sharp eyes because faded marks, accumulated dirt, thick hair, and overlapping brands could make ownership difficult to determine. Calves remained close to their mothers, allowing ranchers to establish ownership before applying a permanent brand to each young animal. Branding involved smoke, noise, ropes, struggling calves, heated irons, and several workers coordinating their movements in a confined space. Cowboys also examined animals for wounds, disease, parasites, or signs that they were too weak to travel safely. Mistakes could cause arguments between ranchers, particularly when valuable cattle had crossed boundaries or carried unclear identifying marks. The roundup demanded days of concentrated labor, but it also brought isolated workers together after long periods spent on distant parts of the range. When the herds had finally been counted and separated, preparations could begin for the long journey toward a railroad town or market. A major cattle drive might involve several thousand animals, a small crew of riders, a trail boss, a horse wrangler, and a camp cook. The trail boss selected the route, assigned positions, managed disputes, monitored the herd, and made decisions about water, weather, and daily progress. Experienced cowboys rode near the front and sides, while less experienced workers often remained behind the herd amid thick clouds of dust. The cook drove the chuck wagon carrying food, cookware, tools, medical supplies, bedding, and other necessities for the traveling camp. Another worker managed the remuda, ensuring that the cowboys could change horses as the miles accumulated beneath them. Before departure, supplies were inspected carefully because a forgotten tool or insufficient amount of food could create serious problems far from town. The first days were often difficult, as newly assembled cattle resisted direction and attempted to return to familiar grazing areas. Cowboys worked to establish a steady pace that moved the herd forward without exhausting animals or causing unnecessary weight loss. Every mile represented economic value because healthy cattle brought better prices when they eventually reached the northern railroad markets. With the ranch disappearing behind them, the crew entered a routine shaped by hooves, weather, distance, and the slow movement of the herd. A cowboy's day often began before sunrise, when the cook's call or the smell of coffee pulled exhausted riders from their blankets. Breakfast might consist of beans, bacon, biscuits, dried fruit, and strong coffee consumed quickly before the herd began moving. Each rider collected an assigned horse, checked the saddle and bridle, secured personal equipment, and prepared for many hours away from the wagon. Once moving, the herd stretched across the landscape as riders maintained their positions and guided cattle away from hazards or tempting side trails. The pace was usually slow because pushing animals too hard weakened them, reduced their market value, and increased the risk of accidents. Cowboys spent long hours watching the same animals, breathing dust, adjusting their weight in the saddle, and listening for unusual sounds. Lunch might be brief, or eaten in the saddle when difficult terrain, missing cattle, approaching weather, or limited water prevented a longer stop. Near evening, the crew guided the herd towards suitable grass and water before settling the animals into a manageable shape for the night. Riders ate supper, repaired equipment, discussed the next day, and tried to rest before their assigned turn guarding the cattle. The routine appeared simple from a distance, but it demanded constant attention because one unnoticed problem could quickly affect the entire herd. The chuck wagon served as the moving center of camp life, carrying the supplies that allowed cowboys to remain on the trail for weeks. The cook often rose earlier than everyone else and traveled ahead so food could be prepared before the tired crew reached camp. Beans, bacon, salt pork, biscuits, dried fruit, flour, sugar, and coffee survived travel better than fresh ingredients and appeared repeatedly on the menu. Beef was naturally available, but ranchers did not want valuable cattle slaughtered carelessly whenever the crew desired a different meal. Water quality varied, and the cooks sometimes had little choice but to use a muddy, mineral-rich, or questionable source. Wind-scattered ash, rain-soaked fuel, heat-spoiled food, insects entered supplies, and wagon movement broke containers despite every precaution. Cowboys were expected to respect the cook because late meals, insufficient food, or poor camp organization could damage morale across the entire crew. The area around the chuck wagon followed informal rules, and riders avoided interfering with cooking equipment or carelessly contaminating drinking water. Coffee offered warmth before dawn, comfort after rain, and a familiar taste during days when almost everything else felt uncertain. Around the evening fire, an ordinary plate of beans and biscuits could become the most satisfying moment of a long and exhausting day. Although gunfights were uncommon, cattle work exposed cowboys to accidents capable of ending a career or a life without warning. A horse could fall into a hidden hole, throwing its rider forward and possibly trapping him beneath hundreds of pounds of struggling weight. A rope wrapped around a hand, leg, or saddle could tighten suddenly when a frightened animal moved in the opposite direction. Cattle horns caused serious wounds, particularly during branding, river crossings, crowded movement, or attempts to separate an aggressive animal. Cuts and broken bones became more dangerous when the crew was days away from a doctor, clean facilities, or effective medicine. Snakes, insects, contaminated water, spoiled food, heat exhaustion, lightning, flash floods, and sudden cold added quieter dangers to the journey. Cowboys had to remain alert even when fatigue made their reactions slower, and several nights of interrupted sleep weakened their judgment. A dependable companion could stop a runaway horse, cut a dangerous rope, pull a rider from water, or recognize illness before it became fatal. For this reason, reckless behavior was not always admired by working cowboys, because unnecessary risks endangered animals, equipment, wages, and other members of the crew. Real courage on the trail often meant staying calm, making a careful decision, and performing an unpleasant duty despite fear and exhaustion. Few events frightened a trail crew more than a stampede, when hundreds or thousands of cattle suddenly began running together through darkness and confusion. Thunder, lightning, an unfamiliar smell, a falling object, a rider's mistake, or the movement of wildlife could trigger panic within the herd. As the animals surged forward, the ground shook beneath their hooves and a dense cloud of dust concealed holes, obstacles, cattle, horses, and riders. Cowboys attempted to reach the front and turn the leading cattle gradually until the herd began moving in a wide circle. Turning too sharply could cause animals to collide, fall, or pile upon one another, creating an even more dangerous situation. Riders sang or spoke softly during night watches because familiar human voices were believed to reassure restless cattle before fear spread through the herd. Lightning illuminated the landscape for only a moment, while heavy rain obscured trails and transformed dry channels into rapidly moving water. After a stampede ended, cowboys searched for injured companions, gathered scattered livestock, counted losses, and attempted to settle the exhausted herd again. The following day still demanded work, regardless of how little anyone had slept or how close the crew had come to disaster. A successful cattle drive depended not on avoiding every crisis, but on preventing fear and confusion from destroying the entire operation. When darkness arrived, cowboys did not enter comfortable cabins because their bedroom was often a patch of ground near the herd. Each worker carried a bedroll containing blankets and perhaps a waterproof covering that offered limited protection from cold, rain, insects, and dirt. Cowboys slept in their clothing so they could respond quickly if the cattle became restless or dangerous weather approached. Night guards rode slowly around the herd in shifts, listening to breathing, hooves, distant animals, wind, and changes in the surrounding silence. Songs helped riders remain awake and may have reassured cattle, although the quiet rhythm mattered more than polished musical ability. Beyond the firelight, the plains could feel immeasurably large, with few buildings, lamps, roads, or familiar landmarks visible beneath the stars. Some nights offered cool air and peaceful skies, while others brought mosquitoes, soaked blankets, hard ground, bitter wind, or cattle that refused to settle. Personal privacy was limited because the crew traveled, ate, worked, argued, and slept within the same small social world. Stories, jokes, memories, and quiet conversations helped cowboys endure loneliness while creating bonds among men from very different backgrounds. Sleep came in short and imperfect intervals before another voice, another duty, or the first pale light announced the beginning of a new day. After weeks on the trail, the appearance of buildings, railroad tracks, smoke, and telegraph poles announced that the cattle town was finally near. Cowboys guided the herd into designated pens where buyers inspected the animals and business representatives negotiated prices with ranch owners or trail bosses. Once their responsibilities ended, the riders washed, replaced damaged clothing, collected wages, purchased supplies, and searched for entertainment. Cattle towns offered restaurants, hotels, barbers, stores, gambling rooms, music, alcohol, and companionship after long weeks of dust and isolation. Prices could be high because merchants understood that newly paid cowboys possessed money and had few opportunities to spend it elsewhere. Some workers celebrated carefully, while others lost months of wages through gambling, dishonest transactions, excessive drinking, or impulsive purchases. Town authorities often restricted firearms because armed visitors, crowded streets, personal arguments, and alcohol formed a dangerous combination. A cowboy who behaved violently could lose his pay, his freedom, his employment, or the respect necessary to find work on another ranch. When the brief celebration ended, many cowboys faced another long journey, either returning south or seeking employment with a new outfit. The cattle town offered temporary excitement, but it did not change the economic reality that most cowboys remained working men with uncertain futures. Cowboy life promised movement and open space, yet it could also produce deep loneliness among workers separated from family, stability, and familiar communities. Letters arrived slowly, and a cowboy might learn about a birth, marriage, illness, or death long after the event had passed. Seasonal employment made it difficult to establish a permanent home, particularly when wages were low and work required frequent travel. Black cowboys sometimes found greater opportunity on the range than in other occupations, but they still faced discrimination, segregation, and racial violence. Mexican and Mexican-American cowboys contributed essential skills while experiencing unequal treatment and seeing their traditions credited to later Anglo workers. Indigenous cowboys navigated pressures created by dispossession, reservation policies, economic change, and restrictions imposed upon their communities. Despite these divisions, daily work could create practical bonds because every rider depended upon the competence and reliability of those beside him. Friendship developed through shared meals, dangerous crossings, repaired equipment, night watches, bad weather, and the countless small favors that made survival easier. Cowboys created songs, stories, jokes, competitions, and personal traditions that transformed an unstable occupation into a recognizable culture. The community of the range was never free from prejudice or conflict, but it was always more diverse than the popular legends suggested. By the late 19th century, expanding railroads, barbed wire, settled farms, changing markets, and harsh winters had begun transforming the open-range cattle industry. Long drives became less necessary as rail lines reached ranching regions, and livestock could be transported from locations closer to where they were raised. At the same time, Wild West shows carried carefully staged versions of cowboy life to audiences across the United States and Europe. Performers demonstrated riding, roping, shooting, racing, and imaginary frontier battles that turned difficult working history into exciting public entertainment. Popular novels and motion pictures later created a simplified cowboy who wandered alone, fought criminals, rescued towns, and answered only to his personal code. The real cowboy had usually worked for wages, followed a boss, depended on a crew, performed repetitive labor, and worried about his next job. His genuine achievements required endurance, horsemanship, judgment, responsibility, cooperation, and the ability to remain patient under uncomfortable conditions. Remembering the Vaqueros, black cowboys, indigenous riders, immigrants, cooks, wranglers, and ordinary ranch hands restores the diversity that the legend concealed. The cowboy deserves a place in American history not because he lived above society, but because he represented the complicated labor that helped transform the West. As the herd settles beneath the stars, we leave the quiet trail, remembering that the real cowboy's greatest story was not the gunfight, but the work.